This 1884 Appalachian family photo on a porch looks innocent. Then, historians uncovered a dark secret. The Thornfield family gathered on their weathered wooden porch in Whisper Valley, West Virginia. Father Jeremiah stood proudly behind his wife Constance, while their 6 children arranged themselves in typical Victorian poses. 19-year-old Mercy held 4-year-old Samuel. The family appeared prosperous, respectable, devoutly religious. But when Foundation archivist Dr. Elena Vasquez examined the photograph more closely in 2019, she noticed something disturbing. The children's eyes showed signs of recent crying, and barely visible in the background, scratch marks clawed into the porch wall. Those marks told a horrifying story of failed escape, twisted religious rituals, and a father who used Scripture to justify unspeakable acts against his own family. How many other innocent family photographs are hiding similar truths buried in our archives? If this story has sparked your interest in the hidden truths of history, consider subscribing to our channel to help keep hidden histories alive. And comment your city and local time. The photograph measures 8 inches by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardboard that has yellowed with age. In it, the Thornfield family stands arranged on the front porch of their modest 2-story frame house, nestled in the rolling hills of Whisper Valley, West Virginia. The image, captured by an itinerant photographer in the late summer of 1884, appears to document nothing more extraordinary than a prosperous mountain family posing for their annual portrait. Jeremiah Thornfield, 45 years old, stands with characteristic dignity behind his seated wife Constance, 38, his large hands resting protectively on her shoulders. His dark wool suit, though not fashionable by Richmond standards, speaks of success in a region where most men wore patched work clothes. Constance's dress, made from fine cotton with carefully pressed pleats, suggests a woman who takes pride in her appearance despite the isolation of mountain life. Her hair is pulled back in the severe style favored by Methodist women, but soft tendrils frame a face that might once have been called beautiful. The 6 children complete the family tableau. Mercy, 19, holds the youngest child, 4-year-old Samuel, on her lap. Her positioning as surrogate mother appears natural, even tender, as she cradles the boy who shares her dark hair and serious expression. The middle children fill the remaining spaces with practiced ease. Twin boys Elias and Ezra, 16, stand on either side of their father, their identical faces bearing the strong jaw and piercing eyes they inherited from Jeremiah. 14-year-old Patience sits demurely beside her mother, hands folded in her lap, while 11-year-old Caleb leans against the porch railing with the casual confidence of a boy comfortable in his surroundings. Everything about the scene suggests prosperity, stability, and devotion. The house itself tells a story of success. Recent improvements are visible in the fresh paint on the shutters, the new planking on the porch floor, and the quality furniture glimpsed through the open front door. Jeremiah's lumber operation had clearly prospered in the years following the Civil War, when demand for building materials soared as communities rebuilt and expanded westward. Whisper Valley in 1884 was an isolated pocket of Appalachian civilization, accessible only by a winding mountain road that tested even the most determined travelers. The community centered around 3 institutions: the Methodist Church that met in the schoolhouse, the general store that doubled as post office, and Thornfield's lumber mill that provided employment for most of the valley's 43 families. Jeremiah served as a pillar of this small society, hosting traveling preachers in his home, contributing generously to church-building funds, and maintaining the moral authority that came with financial success and religious devotion. Neighbors remembered him as a man who spoke with quiet conviction about the importance of biblical obedience and family discipline. His children were notably well-behaved, always dressed properly for church, never heard using profanity or engaging in the rough play common among mountain children. When Jeremiah led family prayers before meals at community gatherings, other parents would point to the Thornfield children as examples of proper Christian upbringing. The photograph remained in family possession for 135 years, passed down through surviving relatives who displayed it proudly as evidence of their respectable heritage. It survived house fires, floods, and the scattered migrations that took Appalachian families to industrial cities in search of work. By 2019, it resided in a trunk of family memorabilia owned by Margaret Thornfield Hensley, great-great-granddaughter of Jeremiah and Constance, who had spent decades researching her genealogy with the dedication of someone seeking to honor her ancestors' memory. When Margaret decided to donate the family materials to the Appalachian Heritage Foundation, she expected the photograph would join countless similar images in their archives, perhaps occasionally displayed as part of exhibits celebrating mountain family life. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the Foundation's chief archivist, initially shared that assumption as she cataloged the donation in her climate-controlled office in Charleston. But Dr. Vasquez possessed both the trained eye of a professional historian and the investigative instincts that had earned her recognition for uncovering hidden narratives in seemingly ordinary historical documents. As she examined the Thornfield photograph under magnification, preparing detailed descriptions for the digital archive, she began to notice details that troubled her growing sense of unease. The children's eyes, she realized, showed signs of recent distress. Despite their formal poses and appropriate clothing, something in their expressions suggested fear rather than mere solemnity. Mercy's protective grip on young Samuel appeared less maternal than desperate. The twin boys' identical expressions seemed strained, as if they were concentrating intensely on maintaining their composure. Most disturbing of all, barely visible in the background near the porch railing, were what appeared to be scratch marks gouged deep into the wooden planking. Dr. Vasquez's curiosity deepened when she began researching the family's subsequent history. Despite their apparent prosperity and Jeremiah's community prominence, the Thornfield children seemed to vanish from local records after 1884. No marriage certificates, no school attendance records, no mentions in church correspondence or social notices that typically documented the lives of prominent families' offspring. It was as if 6 young people had simply disappeared from their community's collective memory, leaving behind only this single photograph as evidence they had ever existed. Dr. Vasquez's investigation began with the contents of Margaret Hensley's donated trunk, a weathered leather chest that had accompanied the photograph through 5 generations of careful preservation. Beneath layers of tissue paper and moth-eaten fabric, she discovered a collection of documents that painted an increasingly troubling picture of the Thornfield family's final years in Whisper Valley. Jeremiah's financial ledgers, meticulously maintained in his precise handwriting, revealed patterns that defied explanation for a simple lumber operation. Between 1882 and 1885, he had made regular payments to individuals identified only as traveling ministers, amounts that far exceeded typical donations for itinerant preachers. More puzzling were substantial purchases of building materials specifically designated for prayer rooms and sanctification chambers added to the family property. The quantities of lumber, hardware, and specialized items like heavy door bolts and window bars suggested construction projects that went far beyond normal home improvements. The ledgers also documented Jeremiah's systematic acquisition of surrounding properties, transactions that gradually isolated his family compound from the broader community. By 1884, he controlled nearly 400 acres of mountainous terrain, creating a buffer zone that effectively cut off outside observation of family activities. The financial records showed he had paid premium prices for land that neighboring families had been reluctant to sell, suggesting either desperation on his part or pressure tactics that convinced reluctant sellers to abandon their homesteads. Dr. T. Vasquez's research into county records at the courthouse nearby Beckley revealed a series of disturbing complaints filed with Sheriff Tobias Crawford during 1883 and 1884. 3 separate families had approached law enforcement with reports of strange sounds and unholy rituals emanating from the Thornfield property during nighttime hours. The complaints described hearing what sounded like screaming, chanting, and other disturbances that violated the peaceful atmosphere of their remote community. One complaint, filed by neighboring farmer Isaiah Garrett, provided particularly unsettling details. Garrett reported that his children had been awakened multiple nights by sounds carrying across the valley that he described as ungodly wailing and the kind of crying that makes a man's blood run cold. He noted that these disturbances occurred with increasing frequency, always during the dark hours between midnight and dawn, and seemed to coincide with visits from traveling preachers who stayed at the Thornfield compound for extended periods. Yet despite these formal complaints, no investigations had been conducted. Sheriff Crawford's official responses, preserved in the county files, dismissed the reports as misunderstandings arising from enthusiastic religious observances protected by constitutional guarantees of religious freedom. His refusal to investigate, despite mounting evidence of disturbing activities, suggested either incompetence or deliberate avoidance of uncomfortable truths that might implicate prominent community members. The breakthrough in Dr. Vasquez's investigation came when she discovered references to Cyrus Reed, a charismatic preacher whose name appeared repeatedly in both Jeremiah's financial records and contemporary church correspondence. Reed had emerged in the late 1870s as a traveling evangelist who promoted what he called biblical purification practices among isolated Appalachian communities. His followers, known as the Sanctified, believed that traditional Methodist doctrine had become corrupted by modern influences, and that true salvation required returning to Old Testament practices of patriarchal authority and ritual cleansing. Reed's theology, as preserved in scattered pamphlets and letters found in various church archives, promoted the twisted notion that family patriarchs possessed divine authority to purify their households through increasingly extreme interpretations of biblical submission and obedience. He taught that fathers had not only the right but the sacred duty to ensure their family's spiritual cleanliness through physical discipline and ritualized ceremonies that corrupted traditional religious practices into vehicles for control and abuse. The most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Vasquez located the private journals of Dr. Amos Whitman, the only physician serving 3 mountain counties during the 1880s. Dr. Whitman's detailed entries from 1884 and 1885 documented a pattern of treating young women from isolated families for what he euphemistically described as nervous disorders, hysteria, and physical trauma requiring Christian discretion in both diagnosis and treatment. His medical notes, written in the careful language of a professional aware that his records might someday face scrutiny, nonetheless revealed clear evidence of systematic abuse. Multiple patients presented with injuries consistent with sexual assault, malnutrition suggesting deliberate food restriction, and psychological symptoms that Dr. Whitman recognized as responses to severe trauma. Most troubling, several of these patients came from families known to be associated with Cyrus Reed's religious movement, suggesting a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond the Thornfield household. Dr. Whitman's entries also revealed his growing frustration with legal and social systems that prevented him from protecting vulnerable patients. His private observations noted that young women seeking medical attention were often accompanied by male relatives who controlled the consultation, answered questions on the patient's behalf, and insisted on treatments that prioritized maintaining family reputations over addressing obvious medical evidence of abuse. The physician's helplessness in the face of systematic violence, constrained by both professional obligations and social pressures that prioritized family privacy over individual safety, created a medical record that served as inadvertent documentation of crimes that contemporary authorities refused to acknowledge or investigate. These discoveries transformed Dr. Vasquez's understanding of the 1884 Thornfield photograph from a curious historical artifact into potential evidence of systematic family violence that had been concealed through institutional complicity and community silence for more than a century. The crucial breakthrough came when Dr. Vasquez partnered with genealogist Thomas Garrett to access sealed court records housed in the West Virginia State Archives. Their combined credentials and research purposes convinced archivists to permit examination of documents that had remained confidential for nearly 140 years, protected by judicial seals that reflected the era's approach to sensitive family matters that could damage community reputations and social stability. Among these sealed files, they discovered the complete record of a formal investigation launched in 1885, triggered not by the complaints of neighboring families or the observations of Dr. Whitman, but by the desperate actions of Constance Thornfield herself. Court documents revealed that in late winter of 1885, Constance had appeared alone at the courthouse in Beckley, seeking urgent protection from Circuit Judge Harrison Blackwood. Her deposition, filed under seal for what the court described as protection of moral sensibilities and prevention of public scandal, provided the first detailed account of years of escalating abuse within the Thornfield household. Constance's testimony, preserved in the careful handwriting of court clerk Samuel Morrison, described how her husband's religious devotion had gradually transformed into something far more sinister following his association with Cyrus Reed. Beginning in 1882, Jeremiah had instituted what he called purification ceremonies within the family, rituals that corrupted traditional Methodist prayer and discipline into vehicles for sexual assault and psychological control. These ceremonies occurred in the specially constructed rooms documented in his financial ledgers, spaces that Constance described as windowless chambers where family members were subjected to what Jeremiah claimed were biblically mandated cleansing practices. The most horrifying revelation in Constance's deposition concerned her eldest daughter, Mercy. According to her mother's testimony, the 1884 family photograph had been taken just weeks before Mercy was to undergo consecration in marriage to her own father, a practice that Jeremiah justified through his twisted interpretation of Old Testament customs regarding patriarchal authority and family purity. The scratch marks visible in the background of the photograph, barely perceptible but now understood in their true context, documented Mercy's desperate attempt to escape this fate by clawing at the porch wall while being dragged back inside after a failed flight toward the woods. Constance's account described how Mercy had tried to run away 3 times during the summer of 1884, each attempt resulting in increasingly severe punishment and tighter restrictions on the entire family's movements. The final escape attempt, occurring just days before the photograph was taken, had left Mercy so traumatized and physically injured that she could barely maintain composure for the formal portrait, explaining the barely controlled terror visible in her eyes when examined under magnification. The court records also contained corroborating depositions from 3 other families across neighboring counties, testimonies that revealed the true scope of Cyrus Reed's influence and the systematic nature of abuse occurring within his network of followers. Rebecca Morrison, a young woman who had escaped from another sect family in 1884, provided detailed testimony about the recruitment methods used by Reed and his disciples. Her account described how isolated patriarchs were gradually drawn into increasingly extreme practices through a combination of religious manipulation, social isolation, and promises of spiritual authority that appealed to men struggling with economic hardship and social powerlessness. The Morrison deposition revealed that Reed's followers operated according to a structured hierarchy that placed family patriarchs in absolute control over their households while making them subservient to Reed's theological authority. This system created a network of complicit families who protected each other through mutual silence and shared guilt, making exposure difficult and escape nearly impossible for victims trapped within individual households. The most tragic element of the court records concerned the fate of the Thornfield children themselves. Dr. Whitman's sealed medical testimony, provided to support the court's investigation, documented that two of the younger children, twin boys Elias and Ezra, had died during the winter of 1884 to 1885 from injuries and neglect resulting from the purification rituals. The physician's clinical descriptions, written in the careful language required by legal proceedings, nonetheless conveyed the horror of children subjected to systematic abuse that their father justified through corrupted religious doctrine. The surviving children, according to Dr. Whitman's assessment, showed signs of severe psychological trauma that manifested in various ways. 11-year-old Caleb had become completely mute following his brother's deaths, communicating only through gestures and written notes when absolutely necessary. 14-year-old patients exhibited what the physician described as nervous collapse, sleeping for days at a time and showing extreme fear responses to any unexpected sounds or movements. 4-year-old Samuel, perhaps protected by his age from the worst abuse, nonetheless displayed behavioral regression and attachment disorders that Dr. Whitman feared would affect his development permanently. Most heartbreaking was Dr. Whitman's description of Mercy's condition when she was finally examined following her mother's court petition. The 19-year-old woman showed evidence of repeated sexual assault, malnutrition from deliberate food restriction used as punishment, and psychological trauma so severe that she initially remained mute for weeks, communicating her experiences only through written statements that documented years of escalating violence disguised as religious purification. The investigation that followed Constance Thornfield's courageous testimony revealed a conspiracy of silence that extended far beyond the isolated valleys where Cyrus Reed's followers had established their reign of terror. Dr. Vasquez and Thomas Garrett's meticulous research uncovered evidence that local authorities, church leaders, and prominent community members had not merely failed to protect vulnerable families, but had actively worked to suppress evidence and silence victims in order to preserve social stability and protect their own reputations. Sheriff Tobias Crawford's deliberate inaction, initially attributed to incompetence or indifference, emerged as calculated obstruction designed to protect a network of influential men who either participated in or profited from the sect's activities. Financial records discovered in the county courthouse basement revealed that Crawford had received substantial payments from businesses connected to Reed's followers, including contracts for prisoner transport and court security services that provided him with income far exceeding his official salary. These financial ties created powerful incentives for the sheriff to ignore complaints and discourage investigations that might expose uncomfortable truths about prominent community members. Circuit Judge Harrison Blackwood, despite his ultimate role in sealing the court records and providing some measure of justice for surviving victims, had also participated in the broader cover-up through his policy of handling sect-related cases through confidential proceedings rather than public trials. His private correspondence, discovered in family papers donated to the state archives, revealed his awareness that at least 12 families across 3 states had been involved in similar abuse patterns connected to Cyrus Reed's religious movement, yet his judicial decisions consistently prioritized community reputation over public accountability. The scope of institutional complicity became clear when Dr. Vasquez discovered correspondence between regional Methodist church leaders discussing their response to growing rumors about Reed's activities. Rather than investigating or condemning the sect's corruption of religious doctrine, church officials had chosen to distance themselves quietly while avoiding public confrontation that might generate scandal or controversy. Their letters revealed primary concern with protecting the Methodist denomination's reputation rather than safeguarding the families being destroyed by Reed's twisted theology. Most disturbing was evidence that several prominent businessmen and local officials had direct financial connections to the sect's activities. Land records showed that properties abandoned by fleeing or destroyed families were often purchased at below-market prices by investors who seemed to have advance knowledge of when families would be forced to sell. Bank records revealed loans and financial arrangements that suggested some community leaders were profiting from the sect's systematic destruction of family stability and economic independence. The broader pattern of abuse extended far beyond the Thornfield family, encompassing what Dr. Vasquez and Garrett estimated to be at least 24 families across West Virginia, and Kentucky between 1878 and 1887. Reed's network operated through a sophisticated system of mutual protection and shared complicity, with sect leaders moving between communities and families, providing shelter and financial support for each other's activities. This interstate network made investigation difficult and prosecution nearly impossible, as victims who escaped or sought help often found themselves in jurisdictions where local authorities were either ignorant of the broader pattern or complicit in concealing it. The most compelling evidence of the sect's extensive reach came from survivor testimonies hidden in private family collections that descendants had preserved without understanding their significance. Dr. Vasquez's appeals through genealogical societies and heritage organizations led to the discovery of letters, diary entries, and written accounts from victims who had escaped or been rescued, but whose stories had been suppressed or ignored by contemporary authorities. Rebecca Morrison's detailed memoir, discovered in a trunk belonging to her great-granddaughter, provided the most comprehensive first-hand account of the sect's recruitment and control methods. Her writings described how Reed identified vulnerable patriarchs struggling with economic hardship, social isolation, or personal failures, then gradually introduced them to increasingly extreme interpretations of biblical authority that transformed religious devotion into justification for sexual violence and family control. Morrison documented specific techniques used to break down family resistance, isolate victims from outside support, and create psychological dependence that made escape extremely difficult even when opportunities arose. Another crucial testimony came from Martha Kellum, whose written account had been preserved by descendants who believed it documented their ancestors' religious experiences rather than systematic abuse. Kellum's detailed descriptions of purification ceremonies conducted by her father under Reed's guidance provided corroborating evidence for practices described in the Thornfield court records, confirming that the abuse followed consistent patterns across multiple families and geographic regions. Perhaps most revealing were financial records and legal documents that exposed the sophisticated network of supporters who enabled Reed's activities through money laundering, property transactions, and legal protection. Bank presidents, county commissioners, and business leaders had created a web of financial relationships that provided the sect with resources and protection while generating profits from their victims' suffering. Property deeds, loan documents, and business partnerships revealed how seemingly respectable community leaders had built their wealth on the systematic destruction of the families they claimed to protect and serve through their civic and religious responsibilities. By 2021, the accumulated evidence from multiple archives, survivor testimonies, court records, and medical documentation had painted a complete picture of the horror that the 1884 Thornfield family photograph had inadvertently preserved. The investigation revealed that Jeremiah Thornfield, under the systematic influence of Cyrus Reed's corrupted religious teachings, had transformed from a respected community leader into a predator who used biblical authority to justify years of escalating sexual violence against his own children and wife, while maintaining his public facade through calculated community involvement and financial success. The photograph, taken just weeks before the planned consecration ceremony that would have formalized Jeremiah's incestuous assault on his eldest daughter, captured the family at the moment of their greatest terror and desperation. The barely visible scratch marks in the porch wall, the fearful expressions in the children's eyes despite their formal poses, and the subtle but unmistakable signs of recent trauma that Dr. Vasquez had first noticed under magnification all served as inadvertent evidence of systematic abuse that had been concealed through community silence and institutional complicity for nearly 140 years. Justice, though delayed by more than a century, finally emerged through the patient investigative work that transformed a suspicious photograph into documented proof of crimes that contemporary authorities had refused to acknowledge. While Jeremiah himself had died in 1887, officially from pneumonia, though Dr. Whitman's private notes suggested suicide following increasing legal pressure and community scrutiny, some measure of accountability was achieved through the broader investigation that exposed the full scope of Reed's network and its institutional supporters. Constance Thornfield's courageous testimony had ultimately saved her surviving children, leading to successful custody proceedings that removed them from their father's control and testimonies that resulted in the arrest and prosecution of 3 other sect leaders operating in neighboring counties. Cyrus Reed himself had fled westward when legal pressure mounted, disappearing into the territories where his subsequent activities remain unknown. But his documented influence had already caused immeasurable damage across Appalachian communities whose leaders had prioritized reputation over protection. Margaret Thornfield Hensley's decision to donate her family's materials, driven initially by genealogical pride, had evolved into something far more profound as the investigation revealed the truth behind generations of inherited trauma and unexplained family dysfunction. Working closely with Dr. Vasquez, she established the Whisper Valley Truth and Reconciliation Project, creating a confidential forum where descendants of affected families could share their inherited stories, process generational trauma, and connect with others whose ancestors had suffered similar concealment and silence. The project revealed that the effects of the sect's systematic abuse had continued to influence families for generations, manifesting in patterns of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and relationship dysfunction that descendants had struggled to understand without knowing their historical context. The courage required for families to confront these difficult truths led to healing processes that honored victims while providing therapeutic frameworks for addressing inherited trauma through community support and professional counseling services. The investigation's broader impact extended beyond individual families to institutional changes that address the historical concealment of family violence and abuse. The West Virginia Historical Society launched a comprehensive initiative examining sealed court records and confidential family materials that might document other cases of systematic abuse hidden behind facades of respectability and religious authority. New protocols were established for handling sensitive historical materials, including partnerships with trauma counselors who could support descendants discovering difficult family histories and ethical guidelines for researchers working with evidence of historical crimes. Contemporary lessons from the Thornfield case resonated with modern understanding of how institutional authority, community silence, and social pressures can enable systematic abuse while protecting perpetrators through respectability and influence. The investigation demonstrated that religious authority, financial success, and community standing can serve as effective shields for predators while their victims remain voiceless and isolated. Dr. Vasquez's meticulous work proved that even photographs apparently depicting normal family life might preserve evidence of hidden suffering, waiting for careful examination and courageous truth-telling to bring concealed realities into historical light. Today, the 1884 Thornfield family photograph occupies a place of honor at the Appalachian Heritage Foundation, displayed with complete contextual information about its dark history and accompanied by testimonials from survivors and descendants who chose to share their stories. The exhibit serves as both memorial to victims whose suffering was systematically concealed and warning about the dangers of unchecked authority combined with community complicity that allows abuse to flourish under facades of respectability and religious devotion. Margaret Hensley has reported that learning the complete truth, though initially devastating, finally provided explanations for her family's generational patterns of trauma, silence, and emotional dysfunction that had affected relationships and mental health across multiple generations of descendants. The investigation offered closure not only for Thornfield descendants, but for numerous other families whose ancestors had been victims of the broader conspiracy that destroyed lives while generating profits and protecting reputations for those who enabled systematic abuse through deliberate ignorance and institutional cowardice. The truth, buried for 140 years beneath layers of community silence, judicial secrecy, and family shame, was finally brought to light through careful historical detective work and the courage of descendants willing to examine what lay beneath the surface of seemingly innocent family photographs that preserve far more than their subjects ever intended to reveal.